A construction project near the town of Bad Camberg in the German state of Hesse has yielded one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made in central Germany, the grave of a high-ranking Celtic figure. So let's have a look, explain what exactly has been found, and also the historical context. So the magnetic field images revealed two thin parallel lines, very straight, as if drawn with a ruler, and they were right next to the roadway. The lines would lead into a circle containing a sharply defined dark rectangle. And these lines resembled the processional avenues leading to burial mounds like those found at other sites, such as Glauburg in the Wetterau region. It seemed a little too good to be true, but in fact, it really was true. The excavators had unearthed iron remnants of a spearhead, which was quite a typical grave good, and from that moment on, it was clear that they had stumbled upon the remains of a burial chamber. The wooden chamber walls had disintegrated over the millennia, and the body had also completely decomposed. However, the soil within the former burial chamber gradually yielded the rich grave goods that had once been entered with the deceased. Among them was solid gold, a set of 3 rings that the individual had worn around their neck, on their arm, and on a finger at the time of the burial. Even during the restoration process, it became quite evident that the immense span over 2 millennia had barely affected this jewelry. And also quite spectacular are the components of a wagon that was placed in the grave, namely the iron fittings from 2 wooden wagon wheels. The 2 wagon wheels had presumably been removed and then placed upright against the wall of the burial chamber, and they would have been richly decorated. They would have featured these large and round hubcaps and also sleeve-like axle fittings that were made of non-ferrous metal, possibly bronze. And we should imagine that at some point they would have likely gleamed in sort of like reddish gold nuance. Remnants of the wooden wagon axle are still embedded in one of the fittings. Now, because the finds are so fragile, the excavators did not really expose them on site, but instead recovered them encased in a block of earth. And they are now being examined by conservators at the State Archaeology Department in Wiesbaden. The earth blocks are first scanned using X rays, and that's a process that has already revealed a couple of secrets. One block, for instance, conceals an Etruscan pitcher that was made of sheet bronze. The combination of all these grave goods is particularly fascinating. So we have gold rings, this wagon, and also the pitcher. And the array of items would place this sort of like princely grave, so to speak, of Bad Camberg at the pinnacle of European burials from that era. It is really significant. Among the smallest clues are beads made of bronze and possibly also glass or amber, and the rings that could have come from a belt as well. There's also a small sickle-shaped knife for everyday use, and we also have pottery shards from a so-called lenticular flask. The two-wheeled vehicle would have also been intended for combat. There isn't any reason to believe it was only ceremonial. And the well-preserved spearhead, the weapon included as a grave offering, points to a male occupant, or at least more likely. The assemblage of grave goods aligns with burial customs from the first half of the 5th century. However, the gold finds, combined with the chariot and the pitcher and so on, are quite unusual, and at any rate, they indicate that somebody of great distinction was laid here. So perhaps a warrior chieftain, a druid, maybe even a wise woman, could have been. Less likely, but not completely impossible. At any rate, we can conclude that the individual was definitely wealthier, more influential, otherwise more significant than their contemporaries. One thing is certain, the Bad Camberg grave is the first chieftain's grave, if we might call it that was discovered in the Taunus region in Hessen. And Celtic populations, they were present in Hessen, particularly during the early Latin period, so in the 5th century BC, and their presence is attested through monumental ritual landscapes, but also extensive trans-regional networks that would have connected the Rhine-Main area to the Mediterranean world. The Celts in this region, they were centered largely in the fertile plain of the Wetterau and the surrounding mid-mountain ranges. And here they developed a highly stratified society. And this is something that is quite clearly seen in their settlement patterns and, of course, their very elaborate funerary practices. The Celts erected open agricultural settlements in the lowlands, but also fortified hill forts on elevated plateaus. And think of this region, the Wetterau, as kind of like the corn chamber of the area because it supported intensive agriculture and also a dense network of about 200 known settlement sites. These open settlements typically comprised small groups of farmsteads or individual hamlets, and they were focused on self sufficiency. At the same time, the production of surplus grain was meant to support the inhabitants of the fortified centers. The fortified sites such as Glauburg, Altkönig, and Dünsberg can be seen as central places. They had different functions. They would have been seats of power, so craft production centers, and potentially ritual hubs. The most prominent example is definitely Glauberg. Glauberg is a basaltic spur of the Vogelsberg mountain. It features a plateau of approximately 20 hectares, and it's all enclosed by massive stone and earth ramparts. I visited this place myself a couple of months ago. Unfortunately, back then I did not have the vlogging camera, so I'm very sorry I cannot provide you personal footage. Anyway, the archaeological evidence here would suggest multiple construction phases, including an early Celtic wall that was eventually destroyed by fire, and this caused the basaltic stones to vitrify. Materials such as spinning wheels were found, so all kinds of tools, suggesting that these were signs of specialized labor and the processing of luxury goods. Some centers were also close to vital resources, such as the salt springs at Bad Nauheim, and this would indicate that controlling raw materials was sort of essential if you were to build wealth and power and wanted it to last. You can see burial mounds scattered all over the region, and we can interpret them as territorial claims on the one hand, but also kind of long lasting markers of ancestral presence. While many cemeteries appear to be small family plots containing only a few dozen graves, the princely burials at sites like Glauberg, they would stand for like this very high top society, like the pinnacle of social stratification. We do have what we might deem a sacred district located at the southern foot of the mountain. That would be an area featuring a complex system of circular and linear trenches, most notably a 350-meter long procession street. The pathway would have been approximately 10 meters wide and flanked by ditches and banks, and it would have connected the burial grounds to the broader landscape. So we are basically dealing with a very structured ritual landscape where performances of different religious rituals or ancestral ceremonies would have taken place. In Mound 1, there is a high status inhumation of a man aged 28 to 32. Sometimes it's really shocking to reflect upon how young these people were when they died. Our prince was interred in a wooden chamber with an exceptionally rich inventory. He had a gold torque decorated with 3 layers, a gold arm ring, a gold finger ring as well, and a bronze beak-spouted jug, which contained a honey-based beverage, so some kind of mead. Also an iron sword, 3 spears with ash shafts, a quiver with arrows, and a shield with an iron boss. Interestingly, there is also a peripheral grave located at the edge of the mound with the remains of a man about 30 to 40 years of age. His ashes were placed in a wooden container along with a rare bronze tube-shaped flagon also containing mead. Notably, this burial included 4 bronze torques deposited as wealth rather than worn jewelry, alongside a full warrior's kit of a sword, spear, and shield. There's also a second mound located roughly 240 meters away from the first one, but it was less visible on the surface due to erosion. However, it did share a very similar structural logic. For example, a circular ditch of about 23 meters. Just as the occupant of Mount 1, this individual too was buried with high status markers. So we have, again, a gold arm ring, a finger ring, an iron sword, and a spear. So the fact that these are so similar in jewelry and weapons would indicate that we are dealing with a sort of uniform elite, a standardized elite, or at least the specific insignia of rank would have been a marker of this Glauburg dynasty, so to speak. Nevertheless, the most tantalizing discovery are the life-size statues carved from local sandstone. The most complete one was discovered in a trench southwest of Burial Mound number 1, approximately 1.8 meters tall and weighing roughly 230 kilograms. The figure wears a composite armor, it seems, potentially made of linen or leather with reinforced sections, and holds a large oval shield with a central spine. And then there's also a sword depicted hanging on the right side of the body. Perhaps more significantly, the statue's jewelry directly mirrors the physical artifacts that were found in Grave 1 in Mount 1. So this would include the neck ring, the torque with 3 layers, the arm ring on the right wrist, and a finger ring on the right hand. As you can see, the facial features are also highly stylized. They have these prominent large eyes, a mustache, and a short beard. And of course, the head is adorned with these two large lateral lobes, which don't refer to Mickey Mouse, but they would have been a very distinctive headpiece. The leaf crown, so to speak, would be interpreted, or has been interpreted quite often as a symbol of high religious or political authority, likely the two of them combined, possibly marking the individual as a sort of deified ancestor or a priest king. At least 3 other statues were found at the site, and this would indicate that we're dealing with a broader statuary program. They might have been intended as idealized representations of the ruling elite in full regalia. So, in a way, they're sort of like a mythical, heroic presence that the living elite would have used to legitimize their own power. Furthermore, the statues reflect a high level of indigenous craftsmanship. They were definitely influenced by Mediterranean concepts of anthropomorphic sculpture, but the execution and specific iconographic details, such as the leaf crown and the torques, they are definitely uniquely Celtic. So, yeah, it's a distinct regional art style that flourished in the 5th century BC, and we quite clearly see these 3 elements combined. So, art and religion and political power. By the 4th century BC, this specific expression of dynastic power began to fade. The monumental graves, like the newly discovered one at Bad Camberg, largely vanished from the archaeological record, and the decline is also linked to the abandonment of the hill forts. The rigid social hierarchies and dependency systems of the early Latin period might have dissolved due to internal social pressures or the massive Celtic migrations of the 4th and 3rd centuries into places like northern Italy, the Balkans, and Anatolia, which would have caused disruptions in the local power bases in central Germany. So, this led to a redistribution of resources and a shift in how authority was legitimized. The Celtic world was becoming more urbanized, and the oppida emerged. These were large proto-urban fortified settlements that could span over 130 hectares. These later centers of power, such as Heidetränke near Oberursel, they were no longer centered on individual heroic lineages, but rather more centralized, possibly more bureaucratized societies, and more focused on communal defense and specialized production. Yeah, so that was it for today. I would really like to do a follow up with more Celtic history. I'm trying to expand the channel a little bit beyond the usual Viking archaeology and Norse literature, which I still adore and will remain the core of the channel. But, there's also much more interesting stuff beyond that. So I hope you enjoyed and learned something useful. And if you want to support the channel, I hope you do, consider membership or Patreon. You get bonus material, including some of my university lectures. Thank you so much. This was Irina. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.